There's a question I never asked myself until I was well past 70. Why did I tell people that? Not big things, not secrets in the dramatic sense, just things. A number, a worry, a plan I hadn't even finished thinking through yet. I'd say it out loud to whoever was standing in my kitchen, and then I'd spend the rest of the week managing what I'd said. When I was younger, I believed honesty meant telling everyone everything. That if you held something back, you were hiding it. And hiding things made you the kind of man who couldn't be trusted. So I talked. About money, about my knees, about what my will said, about who I was annoyed with and why. I thought that was closeness. At 82, I understand it differently. Peace, real peace, usually starts the moment you stop explaining every decision you make. Let me tell you how I learned that, because it wasn't one lesson, it was several, spread out over years, and most of them embarrassed me a little before they taught me anything. The first one was money. I remember the exact afternoon. My daughter and her husband were over, and somebody asked, just casually, how the retirement accounts were doing. I told them. Not the whole picture, just a rough number. Nothing felt wrong about it in the moment, but something shifted after that. Small things. My son-in-law started mentioning a business idea every time I saw him, never asking outright, just sort of leaving the door open. My daughter began worrying out loud about whether I'd be okay if the market dipped, which I hadn't been worried about until she said it. A nephew I barely heard from twice a year started calling more. Nobody did anything wrong. I want to be clear about that. Nobody was greedy or cruel. But a number had entered the room, and once it was there, it sat in every conversation after, whether anyone mentioned it or not. I hadn't realized that money doesn't just inform people, it repositions them. They start picturing you differently, planning around you differently, even worrying about you differently. And most of them don't even notice they're doing it. I didn't either, until I was the one being repositioned. Health was the next one, and that one took me longer to figure out because it felt like the opposite problem. Surely you should tell your family about your health. And you should, the real things. But I used to report everything. A stiff shoulder, a test that came back borderline, a headache that lasted 2 days. I'd mention it the way you'd mention the weather, not realizing that to the people who loved me, it didn't land like weather. It landed like a warning. My daughter would call the next morning just to check. My son would bring it up weeks later. How's that shoulder doing? And I'd have forgotten I ever said anything. I was generating worry I didn't need to generate, for symptoms that, half the time, turned out to be nothing. I started to notice that I felt worse after talking about it than before, because now there were 2 of us carrying something that might not even be real yet. So I changed it, not by hiding anything important, but by waiting. Waiting until I actually knew something before I handed it to someone else to carry. There's a difference between sharing a diagnosis and sharing every ache on the way to one. I used to think withholding the ache was dishonest. Now I think it was just kind. To them, and frankly to myself. The will was a harder one to learn because it touches something people don't like admitting touches them. I'd mentioned, more than once, roughly how I wanted things divided. I thought I was being transparent. What I didn't expect was how those conversations would keep echoing. A comment from one grandchild about what they might do with their share of something that wasn't theirs yet, not unkindly, almost like a joke, but it landed wrong, sat with me for days. I came to believe something I hadn't expected to believe. It's better to prepare responsibly, in writing, with the right people, than to discuss every detail of it around a dinner table. Because the moment a future inheritance becomes part of present-day conversation, you've turned love into something that can be measured. And love measured is love that starts to feel like a negotiation, even when nobody intends it that way. Then there were the smaller decisions, the ones that don't sound like they'd need defending at all. I used to explain everything: why I bought a new recliner, why I was driving 4 hours to visit an old army buddy I hadn't seen in years, why I'd started volunteering on Thursdays at the church food pantry. I'd lay it all out, almost like I needed permission, even though nobody had asked for an explanation in the first place. It took me a long while to understand that retirement isn't asking permission to live. It's finally having the freedom to decide without constantly seeking approval. I'd spent 50 years answering to a boss, a mortgage, a family schedule. And here I was, free of most of that, and still narrating my Tuesdays to anyone who'd listen, like I needed a witness to prove my life was reasonable. One day I just stopped. Somebody asked why I was driving to see Walter that weekend, and I said, because I want to, and left it there. Felt strange the first time. Felt like exhaling the second. Family disagreements. Now that one cost me something before I learned it. There was a stretch, years back, where I had a falling out with my brother over something so small now, I can barely recall the original argument. But at the time, I talked about it with everyone. My wife, my kids, a couple of old friends, anyone who'd sit still long enough. I thought I was just venting, getting it off my chest. What I didn't see was that one disagreement, once it's been told 10 different times to 10 different people, doesn't stay one disagreement. It grows extra branches. People take sides they were never part of. Somebody repeats a version that's slightly off, and that slightly off version becomes what's remembered. By the time my brother and I actually sat down and talked it through, just the two of us, it took 20 minutes to settle what months of other people's opinions had turned into something much bigger than it ever needed to be. I learned, late, that some conversations only belong to the people who are actually in them. My daily routine surprised me the most, honestly, because I hadn't expected retirement to come with so many assumptions attached. The funny thing about retirement is people assume your calendar belongs to the neighborhood. Suddenly, I was the one who could watch the grandkids on short notice, drive Mrs. Pruitt to her appointments, fix anything mechanical for anyone who asked, because, well, you're not working anymore, right? Apparently, once you retire, everyone believes you've been hired as the family's full-time volunteer, and nobody bothered to tell me what the salary was. I said yes to most of it for the first couple of years. And somewhere in there, I noticed I didn't have mornings anymore. The coffee on the porch before anyone else was awake, the quiet hour with a book, the walk around the block where my mind could just wander. Those had quietly disappeared, replaced by other people's schedules. I started protecting pieces of my day again. Not loudly, not by announcing a new policy. I just stopped offering up every open hour like it belonged to whoever asked first. Not because I loved these people any less, because I'd finally started valuing my own time too. And then there's the last one, and it surprised me even writing it down, because I didn't expect this to be the one that mattered most. My dreams. The ones I still had. At 82, I used to announce everything before it happened. A trip I was thinking about taking, a book I wanted to write someday, a class I'd considered signing up for at the community center. I'd mention it at dinner, and somebody would ask a practical question, a reasonable one. How much would that cost? Do you really think you're up for that drive? And the question, even a fair one, would take a little air out of the idea before it had a chance to become anything. I started keeping the early ones to myself. Not because I didn't trust the people asking, because I noticed that an idea needs a little time growing quietly before it can survive being discussed. Some of my greatest peace came from simply keeping a few things between myself and the Lord, and sometimes just myself, until they were ready to be shared or ready to be done. I took that trip to see the battlefield in Pennsylvania I'd been talking about for a decade. Didn't tell anyone until I was back. Nobody had a chance to talk me out of it, including the version of me that liked to talk himself out of things. I think when we're young, we believe sharing everything brings us closer to people. I believed that for most of my life. But growing older taught me something different. Some parts of life become more beautiful simply because they're allowed to remain quiet. It's not about building walls. I don't think privacy ever needed to be a wall. It's more like a fence around a garden you spent a lifetime growing, low enough that people can still see in, still admire what's there, still walk through the gate when you open it for them, but high enough that not every passing opinion gets to reach in and touch the roots before they've had a chance to take hold. I wish somebody had told me that 30 years sooner. I'm telling you now.